Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Strong Stoic Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Tumblin. Before I introduce my guest, allow me to thank my supporters on Patreon who make this podcast possible. If you would like to support me there, you can check me out at Brandon Tumblin on Patreon, also on Substack as well. You get the same benefits for both. You get early access to the episodes. You get exclusive interviews, one with my guest today as well. And I'm also working on an ebook that will be available to my supporters on Patreon and Substack. So consider joining me there. Again, big thanks to my patrons. Also on Substack is a newsletter that I do, my newsletter, where I send out the episodes as they come out, along with other exclusive content here and there. So consider checking that out if you're interested. Finally, I have to mention a new podcast I started with Josh Bertolotti from In Search of Wisdom and Perennial Meditations. Josh is a great friend of mine, and we've started a podcast together called Paradoxically Speaking. So check that out as well. My guest today is Dr. Megan McElheran. Megan is a clinical psychologist and the CEO of Wayfound Mental Health Group, practicing in Calgary, Alberta. So she's a fellow Canadian. Her work over the last 16 years has been exclusively in the diagnosis and treatment of OSI, which is operational stress injuries, in active duty military, veterans, and public safety personnel, firefighters, police, and so on. Megan does extremely important work in the world, and I was very happy for her to take the time and sit down and chat with me. In this episode, we discussed life's hardest truths, dealing with trauma, losing faith, and much, much more. I really dug this conversation with Megan, so I hope you enjoyed as well. There's also two parts of this interview. The first is the standard Strong Stoic guest conversation, which you would be accustomed to by this point. And then there's a approximately 20-minute interview after that, where we focus on Megan's career and her road to success, go over her daily habits that lead to success, and so on. The second interview will be exclusively released on Patreon and Substack, so again, consider joining there if you're interested. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Megan McElheran. Got computers all over the place today.
I'm happy I've never gotten an iPad or like a tablet.
Yeah, I remember when those first came out, I thought it was the coolest thing in the world, like the first iPad. I remember that coming out. I was like, holy shit, there's no keyboard. Like it's just a screen and you can touch it. It's like, that's so cool. And the old iPads couldn't even do anything. Like they had no functionality whatsoever. But I just remember thinking that was so cool, and I've never owned one. Like I've had tablets, but I've never owned an iPad.
And I'm like I fully like try to refuse getting one because I'm like I don't need to add another device into the suite of everything that we have to deal with. So.
Right, and you try and justify it too. It's like maybe when I'm on the couch it would be nice, and I'm like, really? Like that's what you're gonna like you have a cell phone. Like you're really gonna justify paying $1,000 for an additional computer that you have like keep updating?
I know. I got my husband a new laptop for Christmas, which like he hasn't had a new laptop in these 13 years. So I mean it was time, but he like really just uses it to look at houses and watch Netflix, and I'm like, I just don't think this was a good investment.
Right. Yeah. I go for the Chromebooks now when I'm gifting to my family.
Yeah.
It's like it's a good cheap alternative, and yeah.
Right on.
But anyways, thanks for joining me. Yeah. I'm very excited to chat with you, Megan. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you again so much for having me, and it's really cool to just be speaking with someone who's in the same country, which is awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So you're in Calgary.
I'm in Calgary,
correct?
Yeah.
Okay, I knew Alberta. I wanted to make sure it was Calgary. Yeah, I'm out here on the East Coast of Canada, so we have mostly the same accent, but maybe slightly different.
A little different, I think. Maybe mine is different, but I definitely hear the East in the lilt of your voice, which is nice.
Yeah, well, it's funny because since I moved back to Nova Scotia, I hear about and house. Like we really drag it out here, and it's bad. When I was in America, everyone picked up on it and made fun of me for it. So now I hear it. Like in people locally here, and I'm like, oh, that's where I got that. It was from the Nova Scotias. But yeah, so you do a lot of great work in the world. I think that is vital, and some of the things that you do, I think, in many ways, people don't really want to think about. It's one of these areas in life that are really important to so many people and affect so many people's lives, but generally speaking, I think people don't really like to look at these things for various reasons. I think in some sense because it's difficult. And obviously when you're talking about things like the military and veterans, police officers, firefighters, these sort of groups of people that you work with, from a perspective of trying to deal with some of the trauma that they have just by nature of their job. And these jobs are so vital to the functioning of our society. But, as I said, I think there's issues with that come along with that, such as trauma and PTSD and these sort of things. And I'm happy there's people out there fighting the good fight, especially that's someone who's interested in stoicism as well. So what kind of drew you to that particular passion?
So, I didn't know that I wanted to work with uniformed service personnel. That's not where I started my career from. I early on in my career, so this would have been while I was still finishing my bachelor's degree and just ending that period of my schooling. I was working in a program here in Calgary that was for adolescent girls who had been involved in some respect in the sex trade. And these were young women, younger than 18, who were coming to the program that I was working for. And it was like a holistic sort of educational psychology, social work, kind of everything wrapped up in one. And it was a really compelling group of young women to work with. They weren't all that much younger than me now, what I think about it now, but they had just had this unbelievable exposure to trauma in their lives, and particularly sexual exploitation and abuse. And while there was understandably a tremendous amount of trauma and anxiety and fear that they were working through related to those experiences, they were also fairly universally a group of people who are pretty committed to wanting to improve their lives, schooling wise, vocation, their relationships. And I found that very, very compelling. So I went into grad school wanting to understand how could someone go through those kinds of traumas, or trauma of any kind really, and still have this this motivation or this desire to improve themselves, improve their lives, do something good with themselves, right? It seemed like, in my very naive way of thinking about it at the time, that would give everybody the right to not, right? That they would have this reason to justify why they didn't live productive lives. And, I saw it through firsthand experience, and then I engaged in a program of study to really understand that oftentimes isn't the case.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's one of those things where you can look at someone that's been through something traumatic and just have a profound sense of respect for them based on, like you said, I would say that they're still aiming up. They're still trying to improve their lives and trying to be good people. And then there's also obviously other cases where it's just too much, and then you go down the road of bitterness and resentment, and just a very dark road. It's very clear already that you don't shy away from looking at the darker elements of human experience.
I don't. No, I would agree with that. And I have thought for a long time, and I think about this, I write about this, I talk about this all the time. I think the myth of the pursuit of happiness is one of the worst things we've done to contemporary society, and particularly those maybe living in Western society, and as far back as I can find it in our human narrative, because I think that really convinced people of something that was a really untenable bill of goods. The pursuit of happiness and everything that I understand that to mean, pretty much is a recipe for being unhappy. I do.
So
From the perspective of, I think what it has done over time is it has unfamiliarized people with discomfort. It has maybe led them to believe or think that a valuable life is only one where they're feeling good, where good things are happening, where success is relatively easy to come by, so on and so forth. And that just does not line up with what life has to offer us. It never has, and I would argue it's never going to, right? And so, to me, I wish we could have encouraged people towards the pursuit of self-awareness, the pursuit of understanding how we live in the world and how we're impacted by it and how we impact others. Because, even if the pursuit of happiness is linked to different kinds of success or material wealth or what have you, I would also argue that a pathway that you get to success, however you define it, is by knowing yourself, is by being able to live in concert with yourself. That certainly is some of where my interest in Stoicism comes from, for sure. But that's really what I talk about, with people that I work with in clinical practice, and just a way that I sort of look at the world, right? One of the things we can guarantee probably is that we're all going to experience trauma of some kind in our lives. And we could really help ourselves and help each other by doing a better job of being aware of that likely inevitability, and helping people to understand that that's part of what life has to offer, and that actually, those moments are oftentimes where the greatest opportunities for change and transformation and meaning and purpose, wisdom can come from.
Right. Right. You reminded me of something that a friend of mine, good friend of mine here, I've had him on the podcast, Quinn Everett, Olympic weightlifter, very like national level weightlifter, very strong guy, and owns his own company. He's just quite the specimen. But he thinks about this stuff like work. We have basically three categories of things we do in life: work, passion, and then everything else. And one of the points he made to me that really resonated when you were talking there is he said, people always say you should get a job that you love and that should be the goal. It's like, maybe that's like an ideal, but he said, if you have a job that you don't want to drive off the road while you're getting there in the morning, if you have a job that you don't hate, that's a win. And I think it kind of, it stems from what you were talking about earlier, where we have this sort of romantic notion of life in some ways, where if we're not feeling good all the time, it's like, oh, well, something's wrong. And I think that idea kind of resonates with the idea that, it's, if you can have a passion for what you do in the world and live that, and that pays your bills, that's great. But I think we also have to face reality sometimes and understand that, if you can pay your bills, that offers you the opportunity to have maybe a couple hours at the end of the night where you can work on a passion or whatever. But at the end of the day, I think the underlying thing is that life is going to be unpleasant sometimes. And the Stoics would say it doesn't need to be bad, but it's certainly going to be unpleasant.
Well, and I think, yeah, there's many times, maybe even many times in the course of a given day, where we might experience discomfort, and that's not something that we should be trying to stay away from. Oftentimes, if something uncomfortable is happening, it may be telling us about something that requires attention, or we may be challenging ourselves, and so I think that's exactly it. What I see, and I guess what I struggle with on behalf of the other humans out there, is I just think we set ourselves up time and again, right? Like, so even that notion, you never work a day in your life if you love what you're doing. Well, how realistic is that, and why should we treat that as a fixed state of being, right? Like, I love what I do. Sure. There's lots of days and times and weeks and months where I go, I've had enough of this, right? I could use a break from this. So I think we've done something as we've advanced in civilization where we've become intolerant, I think, of certain parts of our humanity. And that is some of the setup that I see, because the end result, oftentimes when someone doesn't love what they're doing, or they're maybe struggling, or they're just uncomfortable or whatever, is too often, and especially, in the lane that I spend time in, people end up finding it a failing within themselves. There's something that I haven't done. I'm not good enough. I've fallen short. I haven't worked hard enough. And there's times when, sure, we can assess, the action someone has engaged in, but, more often than not, people go too far with that. And that actually in and of itself creates its own kind of paralysis.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see this today, as you mentioned. I would say that there's a push in, I would even say my generation, where if young people going into their careers or new companies, if they're not making a difference in their own mind in like the first 2 years, they're like, I got to go somewhere else, man. Like, I'm not making a difference here. And it's like, you're literally on the first rung of the ladder. It's like most people, it's so crazy. You look at people that are really successful. Most of them, especially if they had to work for it, if it wasn't just given to them, it's like that's like at the end of their life.
Totally.
They're like in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and that's when they kind of get their pinnacle, that every dog has its day. But up until that point, it's just grinding, it's work. And again, I think it's just an unrealistic expectation of what life actually is sometimes.
And, sadly or not, life has a lot of darkness in it. right? And we can understand, if you look at any number of sort of religious traditions or spiritual perspectives, this notion that you can't understand light if you don't also understand dark, and I would, I would welcome the opportunity to sit down with anyone, yourself, others, and say, when did you learn the most about yourself? Was it a time when something was being handed to you, when you were at ease, when, you had freedom from responsibilities? Or when was it when you were grinding it out for something, when you were working through a heartbreak, when you feel like you've been betrayed in some kind of a way, or you've experienced a loss? These aren't necessarily, we don't strive, we don't go out naturally to try to find things to sort of test these hypotheses. But my hunch is, most people, if not all people that I would sit down with, would say, yeah, I learned something about myself in the context of that difficult thing I had to confront. And that's what I just wonder, we see the mental health epidemic that we're having across the globe, and just the general, lack of satisfaction people describe in their lives. Like, what if we changed the parameters of what we were striving for, or how we looked at what it means to be human?
Right, right. It's almost one of those hard truths of life, I think, that for you to, in the Stoic sense, flourish, you always have to be under tension. It's not like you have to be in that constant state of tension, and that's hard. I'll use the analogy of I'm a strength athlete, and if you start to get issues in your tendons, so like say you have a knee tendonitis, a good reaction, or not a good, let's say a normal reaction, is, okay, let's take some rest. And maybe sometimes if it's severe, you have to do that a little bit. But that's actually not how you get it stronger. The actual solution to that is to do isometrics, meaning you do a wall squat or something where you're really holding tension in that tendon. And what that does is it allows it to grow by requiring it to grow, essentially. And so I love that analogy as a way to talk about some of these hardships that we have to deal with in life, because it is uncomfortable, and there's tension there, and you have to kind of hold that state. But through that, you become stronger, and through that, you grow. And in the absence of that, which is interesting, if you're having tendonitis and you rest, it gets worse. It degenerates. And I think that's the same with life. Like, once you reach that pinnacle of success, and if you just stop at that point, your life doesn't get better, it gets worse, because you're removing the tension that you need in order to live a meaningful life.
So I'm gonna borrow or steal that metaphor, if you'd be so inclined to let me use it, because in the work that I do, I'm working at the level of soul and spirit, right? But in the work that I do, the freedom that people can find after they have encountered a trauma of whatever kind is by going into the heart of it. It's by going into it, spending time with it, looking at it, feeling it, letting themselves confront the horror or the anger or the fear that they experienced at the time that it was happening. And something happens in that process. They work through some of the emotion, the emotion habituates, or transforms in some way over time, but they also learn that they can handle it. They also learn that I'm actually bigger than this particular incident in my life, that while it was horrifying, terrifying, whatever, and no one's ever going to change that or take that away, that's a constant, I actually can handle this. And it's through approach, it's through engagement that we actually learn that. And more often than not, then people actually start to feel even more confident and more competent than they did before the trauma happened.
Right. Yeah, I think we have no idea in some real sense just how strong we can really be if the situation demands it. I think we have a lot of potential.
Let me be clear what I'm going to say. I'm not attaching what I'm about to say to behaviors, right? But as far as I know it, as far as I've ever read, anything I've ever researched or studied, there's no living example of someone dying from strong emotion. Strong emotion can convince someone to engage in really self-destructive actions, sure. And that's a different story, but the intensity of heartbreak or grief or sorrow that we have the capacity to tolerate and hold and create space for is, as far as I can tell, it's pretty infinite.
Right. It really reminded me of I come from a fishing family, and my dad always, he used to fish with his grandfather, of course, the generational thing, and he used to get seasick like crazy, just spewing up all the time when he was a kid. And his grandfather would always tell him, he'd just kind of shrug and say, well, I never heard of anyone dying from being seasick, and walk off. And, I'm sure people that are listening to that story might say, God damn, what an a-hole, right? Like, this is a really harsh environment. But it really points to one of the things I think that's very fundamental to Stoicism too. It's like, sometimes you just got to suck it up in life. Like, sometimes you really just have to buckle down and suffer through it and get through the other side of it. And obviously there's something at the end of it if you can get through that, and not everyone does. So let's not have a survivor bias here. But there is certainly something to be said about just being able to sometimes just suck it up, as we would
Right.
say
And
it
I
here.
think, like in psychotherapeutic traditions, sometimes that's, we look at, can you tolerate this? Maybe it's not comfortable, but can you tolerate it? And can you tolerate it? If I borrow from dialectical behavior therapy and Marshall Linehan's work, it's like, can you tolerate this without making it worse? Whatever you're going through is hard enough already. Can you just be with it? And I think that's a very stoic approach, and based on a lot of Stoic sort of thought and principles. And then I think we've seen it emerge as things that we see as being effective in helping people sort of recover and reclaim their lives after traumas happen, by creating the conditions that they can tolerate and be with what's actually happening inside of them. That the discomfort and the distress and the and greater problems come from detachment and disengagement and withdrawal and isolation. Right? Those are not typically markers of wellness, and those are typically not times where people are feeling as though they're thriving and they're moving towards, a more successful life, or feeling like they're living their purpose, or whatever language we want to use.
Right. I noticed this when I used to walk. Well, I still do. I'll walk in the cold some days. Obviously, we both live in Canada, so we know what that's like. But there's something interesting when you're walking in cold weather. You can get really focused on the suffering of it. And if you do that, if it's like really cold, what you'll do is you'll hunch up your shoulders and you'll kind of do this, and you might even shake a little bit, even though you're not cold enough to shake. It's kind of, you're just doing it because your mind's telling you to do it. And a trick I learned after doing that enough is that if you can just learn to relax a little bit and get your shoulders down and just feel the cold, the suffering element of it really goes away. What it's not to say that it's not still physically suffering in some sense, but most of the suffering comes from your opinion about it. That's sort of
Yeah.
Seneca's quote: "We often suffer more in imagination than in
Totally.
reality."
Totally. I mean, so, and I think when I think about, our emotional worlds and what happens inside of us, the tension oftentimes people feel and what they're trying to hold in and what they're trying not to have, how much of that, actually really sort of evaporates when they can cultivate the ability to just let themselves be with it, right? So there's really interesting research, like in mindfulness-based stress reduction, and working with people who have migraine headaches and things like that. That people actually do well in those therapies when they can just sort of bring their attention even more fully to the thing that they're experiencing. They actually subjectively feel as though it's less painful, even though they're paying more attention to it. I was in, we were
Right.
in Kananaskis on the weekend, and we were going to these Nordic pools or whatever, and one of them was the cold plunge, and I was like, okay, this is like a stoic toughening exercise. I'm doing it. and actually, it was
Right.
interesting. Like, I had all of these expectations about what it was going to be like, and then once you get past that initial, like literally 2 or 3 seconds, I actually found myself staying in there for 10 or 15 minutes going, this isn't actually that bad. And I was like, okay, this is like a really interesting experience to reflect on. That, again, it's all the creation my mind was giving me versus the reality. The reality was much different than what I was anticipating.
Right. I started cold
Yeah.
plunging as well a couple months ago, and being an extremist in some sense, decided to do it first
Oh,
thing in the
okay.
morning, every morning
Yeah.
for 3 minutes. So I get up in the morning and I would do it. And the first night I did it, or the first night I planned to do it, so the night before, I was like in a state of anxiety the whole night. Could barely sleep, got up the next morning, was like staring at the ice bath. I put it outside on my deck here and did it, and it was fine. And now I'm to the point where I can kind of get into it. I just try not to overthink it too much. I just get up, and go and do it, and then it's over. But it was interesting because it was suffering. I was suffering for hours
Mm-hmm.
before that. And it wasn't even here. I wasn't even experiencing it. And we do that all the time
Yeah.
with stuff. We imagine how things are going to be and how it's going to turn out. A lot of times it's not nearly as bad when we're actually sitting
Well,
into it
so there's some very
and
interesting
feeling it.
research that a researcher named Robert Sapolsky did. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work. It's he wrote a really great book, and you can he's done a it's on YouTube if you look for it. It's called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and one of his central hypotheses is that we have learned, or we've developed the capacity as humans as we are now, to turn the stress response on for purely psychological reasons. So that's what you just described, and what I described, right? The thinking
Interesting.
about it and the worrying about it and the what's going to happen is turning on the stress response, and that's not what it was designed to do. So Sapolsky's sort of perspective is that stress-related illnesses that are, abundant nowadays are, particularly related to this. And so there is tremendous value in being able to learn to cultivate a different relationship with our minds, and how we're
Right.
interpreting things and what we're expecting. And the best antidote to anticipatory anxiety is action.
I love that. So let's dive into that a little bit, because that's the only antidote I can find to the ice
Just
bath in
do
the
it.
morning. It it's
Yep.
just action. And it's so funny because that resonates so much. I was talking to Shane Trotter the other day, who's an author and teacher, high school strength and conditioning coach, and he said that same thing. It seems to be a reoccurring theme that I've learned as well. He said that if you can learn to just act, that's really the secret to success, because we put off stuff
Yep.
so much for whatever reason, and most of the excuses are
Yep.
just BS.
Yeah, they're things we
You know,
create, right? That don't actually stand up to scrutiny and don't stand up to a testable hypothesis, right? And that is very much, personally, this is how I try to operate, but also professionally. It's like, if there's something that you're avoiding, and we all have to, I think, develop a radical willingness to be self-honest, and pull our own covers. If there's something you're avoiding, the best way to find out about it is to go and do it. We're not talking obviously about
right?
dangerous things and lacking situational awareness, but like, if it's having a conversation that you think is going to go, badly, or if it's testing a limit that you have in your own capacities, or just do it. Just find out for yourself, because at least then you're bringing new information into the system, right? Before that, you've got a closed system, and it's not going to learn or do anything different because it's only relying on what it has available to it at that point in time.
Right. And I think you're pointing to something there too, indirectly, which is some of the things in life that kind of bug us in some sense. It's almost like that's a calling to engage
You
in that.
betcha. That's exactly it. I think, like, so if there's something that is stewing with you, if there's something that won't let you rest, it's telling you that it needs action. It's telling you that it needs you to do something about it. And sometimes, the Stoics and dichotomy of control, like, we have to appreciate that sometimes we confront situations that have no solution. Maybe they've already happened, whatever it might be, but it's still telling us we need to do something about it, right? A ritual of recognition, of remembrance, something to bring some closure, some, emotional catharsis we need to engage in. It's different depending on the circumstance and the individual. But usually when things are nibbling at us, it's because they need us to do something.
Right. It's almost like the universe is calling you, like that's your
Right.
problem to fix. This is a recurring theme I've noticed when I ask people why they do what they do. A lot of times it'll be something like, I was so frustrated by the way things were done, or I was so frustrated by this or that was bugging me. I didn't like how that was done. And they choose that as being the problem that they're going to fix in the world. And that's a good indication. It's a good rule of thumb. It's like, if something's bugging you, maybe you should at
Yeah.
least look at it.
Well, this is one of many reasons why I really have gotten sort of compelled and attached to Stoicism, because I love the tenet of find your own way to do some things about this, right? Like, you know, I love that. I'm not sure if you've seen that meme or picture that goes around that says, it's like a blank piece of paper, and it says, here's what you're entitled to. Here's what, you can expect life to give you, and it's blank, right? And I love the Stoic tradition of sort of saying, with all the things that we can't control, find the things that you can. I actually think that's tremendously empowering. Does it mean that we are always served the degree of justice that we think we should get, or that we're insulated from difficult things happening? Of course not, right? But it's saying, look at what is happening and find your place in it. Don't be, I don't love this language, but kind of like, don't be a victim to your circumstance. Things happen, find your way to engage, find your way through. That's what's in front of you.
Yeah, and there's this idea that you only get to sow. You don't get to reap. And sometimes you get to reap. Sometimes it so happens that you get this period of your life where you get a lot of, let's say, joy and happiness, but you're not really entitled to that. That's where I think gratitude can play a huge role too. It's like if you're not in pain right now, if you're having joy, if you're experiencing like some affection for someone, it's like you better fall on your knees and be grateful for that, right? Because that's not you're not entitled to that. That's a gift as far as I'm concerned. You're only entitled to the process, and that's not to say that what you do can't make it more likely that you're going to have situations like that. But I think at the end of the day, it's not up to you at all. That's something that's outside of your
Totally.
control.
For me, I'm always interested in how people came to their perspectives. I'm certainly interested in that for you if you want to share. But I mean, I made a point. I was going down a path when I was like, I guess 19 or 20, that I didn't really like. I felt like I was kind of floating a little bit, and so I would have been 21. I guess I just finished my undergrad, and I was like, I just got to get out of here. I've got to hit reset on my life. And so I went over to Southeast Asia for just shy of a year, and I lived with a Thai family, and I volunteered and took myself out of my circumstance. And then I traveled around quite a bit, and then I sort of came home, and I had this recognition of like, I was born in Canada. I was born to parents who loved one another and stayed together. I was not, exposed to domestic violence and neglect. I was educated. I live in a world where women have different freedoms and liberties. I had access to medical care. None of these things I had any influence over. These were given to me. And that's been an important sort of piece that I have tried to stay connected to. I'm not always perfect at it around, it's not, obligation's not the right word, but it's like, you've been given all of this. It is your calling. It is your responsibility to do something with it, because there's all sorts of people the world over who do not understand those luxuries.
Oh, absolutely. I think being sick is actually a gift in some ways. And I got to be very careful when I say that, because I know being sick there's a lot of suffering involved in that. But what I can say for myself is that when I have a really bad cold or the flu, I've had the flu a couple times. I had COVID, which was really bad. And it gives you an opportunity to kind of reflect on that particular idea that you only really have access to the process of life, and that's really it. And sometimes the process is I'm really sick and I have to stay in bed all day. Sometimes the process is I feel like crap, but I know if I go do some light exercise, I'll feel better, or I got to get myself to the doctor, or I got to do this, I got to do that. And the last time I was sick, I don't know why, but it felt like it affected me psychologically. I felt like I had no motivation to do anything. Like I didn't want to work. I didn't want to go to the gym. I just did not want to do a friggin' thing. Even after, when it was getting better, and I felt like physically I could do it and it would be good for me. And that just really hit home for me, this lesson. It's like, what do you do in that situation? It's like life is kind of not good right now. No matter what you do, you're not going to have a lot of joy. Well, you still find a way to love yourself. And for me, what loving yourself is doing what you need to do to make yourself better and to get yourself better. And that, I don't know, it's weird to say sickness can be a good thing sometimes, but it does offer you an opportunity to kind of reflect on the things that we take for granted, even simple things such as being able to breathe or fall asleep at night.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that what you just said there about like the choice you can make to love yourself. I mean, I think that is a challenging one when people are feeling as though they're functioning at a less than optimal level, right? Because again, there's these shoulds that we just are relentless with ourselves around. But I think about that often, about set things for yourself in the course of your day that you actually reasonably and realistically think that you can accomplish, because the most important relationship we have is with ourselves. And if you are continually abandoning yourself, by saying you're going to do something and then you don't, that actually is really eroding to our self-concept, because we're just basically teaching ourselves that we don't matter, So if it's, saying you're going to go to the gym and then you don't go, or if it's saying you're going to do X and you don't, these don't have to be big feats of anything, If it is simply saying, I'm sick and I'm going to stay in bed today, right? Like that is something that we need to, really be mindful of honoring, because it's not like, imagine what it would be like in any relationship if you said you were going to do something and you constantly backed away or didn't do it, right? Like quickly you wouldn't have that relationship. The person would deem you to be unreliable, And so why would we assume or anticipate that it would be different within ourselves?
Right.
But finding the space between, what do I need to do? What do I need to tell myself? Or how do I need to approach this problem so that I can keep forward momentum, keep approach going? And then where's the line of what I actually need right now is to stop, is to pause. I was reading something yesterday and Seneca talking about, the mind needs rest. We need to afford ourselves these opportunities. I was talking with somebody last week about, Socrates and the pursuit of excellence. And you don't always have to be pursuing excellence, right? But you need to have this space in between where you're, I think, trying to be diligent and intentional and thoughtful about, when am I pursuing and when am I resting? When am I holding back?
Right. Yeah, and I think that's something that we should try and figure out when we're younger. Maybe that's kind of the goal of university or hard education in some sense, or hard work period, is you want to find the amount of work you can really handle in a sustained manner. And this is something that's also really useful to think about. And this makes sense, really. But we fail to realize it sometimes, I think anyone can put in a 20-hour workday, like maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks, right? That's the key there. Everyone can put in an 8-hour workday 5 days in a row, then take the weekend off. There's a huge difference between an 8-hour workday and a 20-hour workday. But the point I'm making is that if you're gonna say, okay, I'm gonna work as much as I possibly can today, you have to understand that that's going to take away some of the capacity that you'll be able to work tomorrow. And so ideally what you want to find is that right amount of work that allows you to recover in time for the next day's work, and find that optimal balance so that you can actually be good in the long term. Because right now, okay, I could start working right now, work 20 hours. Maybe that's good for the next 20 hours, but what's good for the next 10 years? It's like, because that's not going to work for 10 years. So it is about, and sometimes you have to work hard, sometimes you work less, of course, but I think there is that point where you got to find that point, wherever it is. How much can you work sustainably over the long term?
Well, and I think, you've touched on a couple of things that I find interesting, and I tend to agree with that. Again, something that I think we're not super comfortable with is the notion that two seemingly contradictory things can exist at the same time. So you can pursue excellence, right, and you need rest, or you need to, back away from working on your craft, right? Those two things can exist at the same time. Someone can have done a horrendous thing and still be a good person, right? That one doesn't cancel out the other. And I also think, you've been talking about sort of what we can kind of count on, or what we can work with, is the process. And I actually think that we don't love process. Process is kind of messy. We like things that are just so, right, that we can categorize, that we can understand in, structured sort of boxes. And again, I think that's one of the things that we really need to increase our willingness to consider differently, is how do we lean into the messiness that is, life, and what it means to be human.
Right. Well, and optimizing that process, you're never going to figure that right out, because even if you could figure it out, say right now, what the ideal process is, the process depends on where you are right now and where you were yesterday. So you have a projection of progress, right? Now, the thing is that where you are is in constant motion, and where you are yesterday is in constant motion as you move forward in time. So hopefully it's not too severe of a change. It's incremental. But the point is that you have inputs to that system of defining what the perfect process is that's in constant motion. And so you always have to be vigilant and hone in on what that ideal process is.
Yeah, and something I think about is like, could I have known any of this when I was younger? Like, is there a necessary
Oh
ingredient
yeah.
here around maturity and wisdom and life experience, etc.? Because I'm really interested, as you know, in my work with, can we teach people different ways to try to take care of themselves, particularly when they're exposed regularly to unbelievable rates of trauma. And I don't know what the answer is. Like, I don't know if I would be willing to hear and think about and contemplate these ideas when I was 18 or 20 or 25 or even 30 or 35.
Yeah, well, I think that speaks to an idea of realization of some of these concepts too. This is what's so interesting, because two people can give you the same advice, but one of them really hits you and the other one you're just like, you're just repeating
Yeah.
standard advice. And it's interesting what the difference there is, but yeah, it's weird. I think about that often too. Like, could I go back in time and really explain myself some of these concepts and learn them earlier? And I'm not sure. Sometimes I don't think we're ready
Yeah.
to receive some of these lessons.
Well, and so a similar question is, if you think about times in your life where you've had the hardest times, like, would you go back and erase those, right? Like, when I think back on my life and the most difficult times that I've had, I actually am at a place in my life where, I absolutely would not remove them, and there were some pretty difficult times and lots of distress and confusion and, any number of things, but I would not take them back for what they've, meant in the course of my life and for where I'm at in this particular moment. And so if I say that in equal measure, I sometimes think about, well, then we have to be prepared to adopt that same perspective for the next difficult thing that comes, you know?
Right, right. And I think having that history of getting through things helps as well. But there are still some situations where you have to deal with those darker moments, and sometimes like a loss of
Mm.
faith, I would say, where you're not sure if you can get through it. You're not sure if you're capable of it, if there's an end to this. And so it's interesting because it's easy to say, oh yeah, I wouldn't take away that experience. But then when you're experiencing it, sometimes those moments are really, really dark. And yeah, I don't know. What do you think about how to get through those particularly loss of faith, dark moments?
Wait, honestly, like, I
Yeah.
think, have we all had the experience? I know I have, of sort of going through something and thinking, I can't handle this for one more minute. I can't stand this. And then lo and behold, you stand it. And then, the next hour, the next minute, the next second comes along, and, and before you know it, the days pass and the years pass. So I do think there is something about, when we have a loss of faith, when something happens to us, my hope would be that we have some foundation against which that happens. We have a belief system, or we have existing relationships, or we have maybe an element of understanding ourselves. And those are our friends. Those are the things we need to turn to in those times where faith is hard to come by or all hope seems lost, right? And then wait, and then don't make the moment worse. Let time pass, put in good ingredients, talk to people, connect with people, look at the world on a broader scale and your part in it, and, even your life, and recognize this isn't always going to be like this.
Hmm. Yeah, I've certainly some of those darker points, even if you follow, say, the Stoic tradition of, let's be a good person kind of thing. I think there's two elements of that from a faith perspective. There's faith that that's the answer, that virtue is, the only good, and that's what we should strive for. But then this is where it gets really dark, I think. Then there's the faith of, can I achieve that? And I think, like, my dark moments in the past, that's been the question. It's not is virtue the only good? Is that the ideal? It's not that. It's, can I achieve that? Can I get better? And what's interesting about that is, if anyone in the world, and I mean that, asked me that question, could they get better? I wouldn't hesitate. I'd say, no, of course you can get better. Here's where you are right now. Here's what we can work on, and we'll get better. But then when we're in our own heads thinking about these things, it's just not the same thing at all. And so maybe that points to some of the importance of having some externals around you, some people
Mm-hmm.
that can sometimes just call you out on some of the bullshit that you're
For
telling
sure.
yourself.
I mean, I think having that external mirror can be really helpful. I also think that, like, so I think about this sometimes, like, okay, so, in times that have been very dark for me or even for other people, it's like, do you actually want to die? Like, do you want to not be here anymore? Right? Or is there something about living that is feeling insurmountable? And then can we find ways to, break down these insurmountable experiences or tasks or whatever they might be into smaller pieces, right? So, like, I think about, sometimes if people are going through, um, criminal matters, right? Like, let's say there's been a sexual assault, and those can go on for years, right? And it seems like I can't handle this. Well, can we boil this down into bite-sized pieces? And what actually can you handle? What actually can you do? What's the smallest piece of something you can manage right now? And so there's that. And then I also think it's like, you're speaking to it. At the end of the day, we're never alone because we're always with ourselves. We are always talking to ourselves. We are always attending to what's happening inside ourselves. And that is something that we need to pay attention to the most when we're in those moments of struggle and hope and loss. So what does that mean in that moment where I can't tolerate this? Like, have you lost hope in yourself? Have you lost faith in your ability to do something different? Well, then how do you know? Right? And again, there comes back that action, that testing out. What do you actually, what are you basing that off of?
Right. Well, I think the harshest ones, and maybe this fits in with PTSD, and maybe I'll get your opinion on that. But the hardest ones is when you lose your grounding on who you are. So that's if you do something that you wouldn't expect yourself to be able to do, something particularly evil, or if you become, even if it's something you've already been doing, but you're suddenly aware of it because of some kind of catastrophic event. For example, losing your job. You think you're the cat's ass at your job, and then all of a sudden your boss calls you in and fires you. And that's what happens there, I think, is that, so you have this process that we talked about earlier. What's feeding into that is where you are and where you want to go. But all of a sudden, that big input, where you are, is completely different than it's shattered. So all of a sudden, you're just falling. So now your process is shit. Where you thought you were is completely, in your own head, you think, no, I have no idea where I am. And now you're even questioning if you can even get to where you are because you don't even have the foundations of how to get there. How do you think that ties in with PTSD?
Well, I mean, certainly, I think one of the core experiences in PTSD is people do feel a sense of estrangement or alienation from themselves. Lots of times because, people can go through trauma and not develop PTSD. And those seem to be people who have, for whatever reason, and there's lots of reasons, the ability to confront and engage and process and work through what happened. When people go on to have a sort of post-trauma kind of reaction, there's oftentimes things that are happening that are disengaging themselves from their own experience. And the more that happens in sort of a consistent, perpetual kind of way, increasingly people feel like, I don't know who I am. I don't know what I stand for. I don't know what this life is all about. I don't understand other people, right? And there's just more and more and more and more disconnection that happens. So this alienation fuels alienation, And I don't know. I mean, like in your in your job example, it's a great example because I think, that can happen. You're going along, you think things are fine, you think you're doing really well, and then boom, something changes. Or, like you come home at the end of the day and your spouse tells you they want a divorce, or, would these be considered sort of the kinds of traumas that can lead to PTSD? No, not necessarily, but they are big events and they can be very traumatic and very emotional for people. There's more information required, right? Like we don't do ourselves any favors when we try to interpret our experiences without gathering as much information as we possibly can, right? So like because context is super powerful. So like in the job example, what's happening in that context? What do you have awareness of and information over? And then what are the things that you actually don't know and aren't aware of? And is it possible that things happen in this world that we don't actually know all the reasons for? Is that a possibility, right? So it's like, in the job example, there might be a place to go, okay, well, can we non-defensively try to consider what might have been your part in that, right? Like, were you being aggressive in your interaction style? Were you falling short on deadlines? Whatever. Like, is there some actual something to substantiate? Can we look at that? And can you have the ego strength to tolerate looking at that, because we're not perfect and we all err? But then can you also leave space for the fact that sometimes things happen and we don't understand the reasons for them, and it may or may not have to do with personal failing, personal incompetence, things that would lead you to go, oh my God, I'm not who I thought I was, right? There's probably more to the story than that.
Right, for sure. Yeah, there's a Gandalf quote I love. Even the very wise cannot
Right.
see all ends.
We all have blind spots.
Which is, yeah, every one of us. And sometimes the blind spots, no matter how many people you have around you, you still won't be able to see them, which is kind of a scary thought as well. And I think, to circle back what you mentioned earlier, because I think it's important, one of the ways to get out of that is through action. But it's so hard to do, though. So you say, okay, so you lost faith. You still have your fundamental values that you believe in, and let's say you still have faith in that, but maybe you don't have faith that you are capable of achieving that. It's so hard to go and act, and I don't know, like I've certainly been there, and you just, I don't know what happens. I guess you have to do something. Like, what are you going to do? So you have to do something. So maybe a good rule of thumb is to act in a way that a Stoic would act, or whatever philosophy that you follow, and just kind of suffer through it and go do it. And what's interesting about those moments is that you get this resurgence of faith afterwards, where it's so powerful and it's so strong. And so it's a weird, interesting thing that sometimes the darkest parts of our lives where we lose faith can result in some of the parts of our lives where we gain the most faith.
And I believe, I have a lot of belief in the power of the human spirit, so I just think about like those really dark moments. And I want to like disclaim, like, if somebody was actively suicidal, or in a vegetative depression where they needed help, I mean, that would require a different degree of intervention, right? But outside of those conditions, what I might say to someone is, well, then go home and lay on the floor and just lay there forever, because what's going to happen? You're going to lay on the floor, and maybe you're going to feel horrible, and your stomach hurts, and you cry, and I don't know, maybe you can throw up, I don't know. But then you just lay there and lay there and lay there. I firmly believe, I strongly suspect that at some point the person's going to go, I've had enough of this. I'm going to get up. And even if it is, I'm going to get up and I'm going to transfer myself to the couch, or I'm going to go and have a shower, or whatever. It's still movement in a direction, right? Like, I by no means am suggesting that when people are having those extremely dark times, and particularly when they're recovering from tremendous loss, like, it's not a, okay, well, you should be good because, you should have this thing with yourself. It's not like that, right? And actually, I think we have to give people space for the fact that transformation and healing takes time. Like, when we think about the valleys that have cut through mountains, right? Those don't happen in the course of a week. It takes time, and transformation oftentimes does require pressure and time and space to happen. But it truly is my fervent belief, and I've seen it time and time and time again, that if you leave people to their devices and you don't get this other stuff in the way, they will find a way through. Right? We actually, I really believe this. We are inclined towards trying to move towards those greater spaces of like healing and wisdom and recovery. I really, really believe that.
I think that's a beautiful spot to wrap up the first part. So I'll give you an opportunity to tell people where to find you, but just for the listeners, there's a part 2 to this, which will be an interview basically focused on Megan's career and what has led to her success, and the daily habits that she implements. Will be very practical, so you can check that out on Patreon. But Megan, thanks again for this chat here. Where can people find you if they want to seek you out?
Well, thank you for having me. I just love these kinds of conversations, so thank you for allowing me to participate. So I guess I would say a couple of things. You can find me and my practice here in Calgary at www.wayfound.ca. I would let any of our uniformed service personnel across the country know that right now we have funding available for our Before Operational Stress program, and a link to that free funded program can be found at our website, again, at wayfound.ca. But if you Google Before Operational Stress, That will give you some insight to the program and how to access the funding that's available right now.
Perfect. Great to hear. Thanks again so much. Until next time.